Autism and intelligence. What do you think? Does IQ improve your social skills or impede your social skills? Have you ever had the experience of being smart enough and aware enough to understand a problem, but not smart enough or intelligent enough to figure out what to actually do about the problem? There are a few counterintuitive things going on here, so let's take a closer look. Hi everyone, Paul Micallef here from Autism from the Inside. I make weekly videos sharing the human side of autism, so make sure you hit subscribe to get the latest content. So as many of you may already know, my special interest is in emotional intelligence, and as it turns out, there's a very interesting relationship between emotional intelligence and regular IQ intelligence. You probably won't be surprised to hear that having a higher IQ doesn't necessarily mean you're going to have better social skills, better emotional intelligence. But did you know that it can actually have the opposite effect? This kind of makes sense, and it's definitely been true of my experience that one of the core things about having autism is a difficulty relating to your peers. So yes, there's a lot more to autism than that, but that's one of the really central parts. So when I'm trying to relate to my peers, having roughly the same intelligence is kind of helpful. This is perhaps easiest to see in the case of intellectual disability. You can imagine that for someone with an intellectual disability, it might sometimes be difficult to keep pace with a conversation that has a lot of information or a lot of complex things going on. I don't have direct experience of that myself, but probably the closest thing for me would be trying to understand a second language. I can kind of keep up with basic conversation, but as soon as it gets above a certain level, I just get lost, and then suddenly I have no way of participating in the conversation. I literally need to stop the conversation and say, hey, could someone please help explain to me what's going on, because I didn't catch that. Except socially, I'm just not going to do that all the time. I'm not going to constantly stop the conversation so that I can keep up when everyone else is moving at a faster pace around me. So what tends to happen is that I just accept that there's a significant amount of information going way over the top of my head that everyone else understands, and I just have to recognize that I'm just not going to get it. And that's difficult socially. It limits the way that I can interact with my peers. I'm thinking of a specific time when I was doing a study exchange in Malaysia and most of my friends were speaking Indonesian to each other. Even though that's actually a language I learned at school for 5 years, I would get lost so quickly trying to follow conversations that I just didn't even bother trying after a while. Everyone was really friendly, they were including me, and it was fantastic, except I just couldn't quite understand the nuances of what was going on. So in this case, while I was still included socially, it was definitely a barrier for more intimate connection. Now, I don't know how many people know this, but IQ scores actually follow a standard deviation bell curve, which means that the average is exactly 100 and a standard deviation is exactly 15 points in either direction. So what that means is if an IQ of 70 gets you a diagnosed intellectual disability, then an IQ of 130 means that everyone in society, from your perspective, has a diagnosed intellectual disability. Hopefully that's easy enough to see, since if you go 2 standard deviations, 15 plus 15 is 30 below the average of 100, you've got 70, which is a diagnosed intellectual disability. And if you go 15 plus 15 is 30 above the average, which means that from your perspective, someone with an IQ of 100, i.e. average intelligence, might as well have an intellectual disability in terms of the gap that you're feeling from your perspective. So what does the other side look like? I've described briefly the experience of not being able to keep pace with what other people around me are saying. And the opposite is being frustrated that the people around me can't keep pace with what I'm saying. In other words, I constantly have to slow down and simplify what I'm saying so that the people around me have some chance of understanding what I'm trying to get at. Now, in some ways, this is not a barrier to social inclusion at all. Just like my experience in Malaysia, I couldn't understand, but I was still included. The challenge, though, is that if it's difficult to connect with a person due to a difference in IQ, then it might be difficult to participate in the kinds of activities that people do socially. I personally find it extremely difficult to make light conversation and talk about sports or politics or other kinds of things that I just don't really have that much of an interest in. I would much rather talk about complexity theory and the latest research in AI that I've been reading about. Except that for the vast majority of people I interact with on a regular basis, that is not a level of complexity that we can easily converse in. In a sense, our social communication is limited by the lowest common denominator. Just like if you try and talk to me in a language other than English, maybe I could very easily talk to you about my day, but trying to share complex thoughts and feelings is going to be a challenge. So what does this have to do with autism? Well, like I said earlier, a big part of the autistic experience is social isolation and a failure to have the opportunity to learn skills of social reciprocity. And so having an intelligence either way higher than the average or way lower than the average can make this even more difficult. I'm sure you can imagine a typical schoolyard scene where either the intellectually disabled kid or the extremely intelligent kid get bullied mercilessly just because they have no way of defending themselves. And here's where the really counterintuitive fact comes in. Have you ever had the experience of being smart enough and aware enough to understand a problem, but not smart enough or intelligent enough to figure out what to actually do about the problem? There's this really weird paradox where, ironically, the more you know about a problem, sometimes the harder it is to find a solution to that problem. I've heard this phenomenon described as true but useless. And for example, you could imagine, what if I knew everything there possibly is to know about climate change? I don't, by the way, I'm not an expert in that. But even if I knew the exact state of the world and the exact influencing factors, that wouldn't necessarily get me any closer to finding a social, political, community solution to the actual problem. I would just know how screwed we are with even more detail. And there's a kind of helpless feeling that comes along with that knowledge. It's like I see everything so clearly and I still can't do anything about it. And that's where the emotional intelligence aspect comes in. In 1995, I think it was, Daniel Goleman wrote a book called Emotional Intelligence. And the thing that I found really interesting about this, I don't know if you noticed the second title, it's Emotional Intelligence, Why It Can Matter More Than IQ. So we've already seen that having too high or too low IQ can be a barrier to developing social skills. But actually there's another factor, and this is exactly what I'm trying to capture in the book that I'm writing, Unlocking Your Emotional Brain. This second factor means that the more intelligent you are, the more you tend to rely on that intelligence and rely on being logical and rational and reasonable in a situation. That can kind of spiral a little bit so that it's also an additional barrier to learning those social emotional skills. And this has to do with the true but useless trap. If I'm very intelligent, I might be tempted to think that if I know more about a situation, I am going to be in a better place to find a solution and do better in the situation. And for a variety of reasons that I'm outlining in the book, it turns out that's not the case. In fact, often the opposite is true. Have you heard the phrase, ignorance is bliss? Well, that refers to the fact that if I don't know what's happening with climate change, it doesn't affect me personally, right? I don't feel bad about it. I don't get stressed out about it. Whereas if I do know the precise details of exactly how screwed we are, and I still can't actually do anything about it, then I might as well be back in that ignorance phase where I'm still not doing anything, but at least I feel okay, compared to knowing every specific detail and having this additional layer of helplessness. Now, you're probably thinking, yeah, but ignorance isn't all that great, is it though? And you're right. So the whole point of my book is to talk about how to bring both of those things together. How do we have the intelligence side of it so that we're not ignorant and we can use our rational brain, but at the same time leverage emotional intelligence to find a simple, practical solution to the problem? I feel like I should probably give an example here. I personally have developed a fairly high degree of self-awareness, and I naturally have a high degree of empathy. And what that means is when I go into a social situation with other people, especially other people I haven't met, I get a lot of information. And you'd kind of think that that was a good thing, but actually what that tends to do most of the time is overwhelm me. So there's a very specific situation I'm thinking of. I used to go to this gym class, and when I walked into the room, for some reason, everyone avoided eye contact with me. And being quite perceptive to these things, I really noticed that and I really felt that. And so the temptation is to ask myself questions like, why are people doing that? What can I do about it? Is it something about me? What's going on with the situation? Let's analyze all of this huge amount of information that I'm getting at the moment. And when I go down that path of trying to use my intelligence to bridge the social gap, it doesn't tend to work very well. So instead of trying to come up with this elaborate intelligence scheme of what can I do in this situation, I ignored most of that and instead leveraged my emotional intelligence skills to implement a very simple strategy. Want to know what my strategy was? Hi, Mike. Yep, that's it. I basically picked someone I knew the name of and I said hello and used their name, and that's it. And what happened in the situation is they looked up at their phone and said, oh, someone said my name. What happened? Hi, you, whoever you are. And unconsciously, they're thinking, oh, who is that guy? Oh, he knows my name. I should probably know his name, I guess. So maybe I'll notice him next time he comes in. And this is just a really, really, really simple example. The point of this whole thing is to emphasize that the solution was very, very simple, even though the situation had a lot of complex factors going on. And this is why emotional intelligence can matter more than IQ a lot of the time. If we're dealing with people, success looks like working with those people effectively. And on a personal level, realizing my own autism, realizing lots of this other stuff that we've been talking about, it just helps me recognize it's a real thing. The barrier to connection, the barrier to socializing, it's not a deficit with me. It's a real, tangible barrier in my environment. I have a couple of friends with intellectual disabilities, and we just need to acknowledge there are some barriers for us connecting. We work with those barriers and we do the best we can, and it doesn't help for me to get frustrated that I can't talk about complexity theory or other things like that. Just like there are some other mainstream things like going to the pub or talking about football that I can't connect with my other peers about. It's all about social connection and finding ways to connect with an individual, acknowledging the real barriers in connecting in the ways that I would like to connect sometimes. Anyway, I'm probably going around in circles with this, so I might leave it there. If you'd like to hear more about the book that I'm writing, Unlocking Your Emotional Brain, there's a dedicated page for that on my website, as well as lots of other resources you might be interested in, online social events, monthly webinars, lots of stuff there. I definitely recommend checking it out, especially if you haven't had a look recently. There's quite a bit of new stuff there. So that will do for today. Thanks again for watching. Please leave a comment if you can. I'm always curious to hear your experience, if you can relate to having a difference in IQ being a barrier in social situations. So until next time, thanks for watching. I hope you enjoyed this video, and I will see you again next week. Bye.